Thank you very much. Before I start, let me only say that I'm very happy about the Bochum Turin collaboration, and especially it is due to Alberto, but here, and Vincenzo, Peter, and Mara, who made a great job putting this together. So, furthermore, I want to thank collaborators from Bochum, Francesco Marchi and Petra Vetter, with whom I co-authored already, and recently Alfredo Benazzani is also joining the team working on these topics. I first want to outline the stage about the debate about cognitive penetration very shortly, discuss some core examples only defending cognitive penetration in a narrow sense, focusing on early visual processing. But then I want to switch to discussing late visual processing, discussing an own experiment using hypnosis, of course commenting on David Bitter's talk, and finally discussing the cognition-perception divide. So the classical view is that we have bottom-up processing starting with similar sensory stimulation, then visual processing leads to visual experience, which should be separate from the judgment based on visual experience. The core evidence for a modular view is, of course, the well-known lesion studies from maybe V4. A lesion of V4 leads to perception without color, and the lesion of V5 leads to perception without dynamic, and this indicates some modularity. The other argument is based on something like the stability of visual illusion. All you know the Müller-Wiener illusion, which remains stable even if we know and measured the sameness of the lengths. So common ground for both views, so the modularity and impenetrability view, is that the influence of background concepts, images, and so on the judgment is not at the debate here. What is really debated is the influence of higher level concepts or higher level processing on early and late visual processes, while Collision is the defender and Raftopoulos of early visual processes as being impenetrable, while Firestone and Scholl go even further on and argue that everything about perceptual processing is impenetrable. Here is a quote to highlight their radical claim. We have argued that there is a joint between perception and cognition to be carved by cognitive science, and that the nature of this joint is such that perception proceeds without any direct, unmediated influence from cognition. And they add, after discussing very useful methodological standards in their BBS paper, until this high bar of methodological standards is met, it will remain eminently plausible that there are no top-down effects of cognition on perception. And this is a clear statement about this kind of and widened view of cognitive penetration. Sorry, but now I start with discussing only very few tips of, I think, still very good, but we see debatable examples concerning early visual processing, and then go to late visual processing. We already heard about the example discussing object color and their memorized color and their influence on processing of color of typical objects like bananas. I just remind you about this study because, the study is a kind of, you have the objects and you now have a joystick where you can change the color of the banana until it is a kind of non-visible at the gray background, and the observation is that the adjustment in the case of banana is done to a slightly bluish hue, in the case of neutral objects not. We have heard a very distinguished presentation of that. So I think this situation is not settled, but conceptually one could also make the point that, okay, maybe this is a visual template, but not yet anything that deserves to be characterized as concept. Therefore, maybe we have a clearer case about concepts going to the Levin and Bernardi case. This is also known to this audience. But the way to present the Levin-Banaji case here is to focus on a situation where you have a morphed intermediate phase between the African and the Caucasian phase, and to take only one picture of the intermediate phase, and to either add the label plaque, only the label plaque, and make the test that you now adjust the color, the color between the brownish color that matches the color you actually perceive, or you have the label white with the same phase and makes the joystick matching task, and then what you observe is a kind of this plaque, this kind of shift of color in the case of more darkish color with the black label or lighter color with the white label, despite having the identical sensory input. And this is a kind of not covered by other interesting challenges put forward by Firestone and Shaw. So this example is still on the table for the debate, and it seems to be that here the semantic label of black and white has an influence, a causal pathway to changing the perceptual processing, such that in this, of course, fine-grained distinction in color processing is detected. The other example, which we also already discussed, but I think it's still on the table, is the debate about semantic categories. The experiment is based on different categorizations. So you have the Russian lexicalization and the Greek lexicalization have two terms for blue. The Russian thinei or golubui, something like that. And then the English speakers and German speakers don't have these two categories. And the test was done in the following way. So you see two colors, and you have to push a right or left button as soon as you see the color coming up, matching either the left or the right. And here you point the left color, left button, of course. And then you measure the reaction time. And the point is that in the case of here, between categories, so the Russian have light blue and dark blue as two categories. This is a between category case, and this is a within category case, where both are in the area of dark blue, and of course the color difference should be equidistant. And nevertheless, for the Russians, the cross-category distinction is processed quicker than the within-category distinction, while for the English-speaking people, it's both a within-category test, and this is matched by the reaction time. Interestingly enough, that was not mentioned this morning, we also have an EEG study which actually exactly uses the same kind of setting and dealing with light blue and dark blue, and this time with the English and Greek speech community, and the mismatch negativity, as you already have it introduced, indicates a mismatch with the expectation that is built up. And in this experiment, the expectation was built up by having 10 times the same patch of blue showing up. You just perceive 10 times a light blue, and the 11th patch, unexpectedly, it's not announced, at some point a patch is a little bit darker. And every person then reacts with a mismatch negativity. Now the question, how large is the mismatch negativity? And systematically, the mismatch negativity is larger for cross-category trials than for within-category trials. And for cross-category trials, it's larger, and that means, again, for the Greek-speak community, light blue and dark blue is a cross-category trial. They have a high N400, the same height as between green and blue, and for the English-speaking, that's not the case. Okay, in the case of dark blue and light blue comparison. So, again, this is not settling the thing, but there is still, it's still on the table, because what this EEG study shows there is actually, and this EEG study has a perceptual processing time of 120 to 150 milliseconds. It's early processing, so it's an indicator that the perceptual experience is changed and not the perceptual judgment. What is not settled is what actually causes this changes the perceptual experience. And this was highlighted by Yasmina today. It could be, in principle, it's not settled, that there is an inborn or given blue-green boundary. That's a theoretical possibility that causes a pathway without any cognition playing a role. The second, it could be that together with language acquisition, we acquire a green-blue boundary that is then established in the cognitive system and changes exactly the processing such that the experience is produced. Or there is an online effect of the activation of the color concept in this very situation. So the only case that is completely uninteresting is the first case for the cognitive penetration. That would rule it out. The other two cases are still interesting. Of course, third case would be the most powerful one. But this is a kind of where the debate about these cases is. Now, let me stop here with debating early, a kind of cognitive penetration about early visual processing, just matching out or characterizing where we are and where we have to go. Now, what about late visual processing? Can we separate it out and characterize and investigate it systematically? Because as we have seen, Pelishin and Raftopoulos are authors that are satisfied if we can keep early visual processing to be impenetrable, but Firestone and Scholl, they want to have it all impenetrable. So it's helpful to debate that case explicitly. And here is a characterization of this case. And you know the case of the Dalmatian dogs. This is another case which you may have not seen, some of you. If you haven't seen it, you may only see black and white dots. Who doesn't see any figure in it? Okay, a few people don't see a figure in it. Now I tell you there is a cow. Can you now see the cow? Yeah. And if you don't see the cow, now I help you with that. Okay, I think now you see the cow. And here are the ears, there is the mouth. Okay, if you saw the cow, you cannot help but see the cow. Okay, all this phenomenon is very well known. What about the systematic point here? The systematic point is that we already have a processing of these black and white patches which are clearly spatially organized. There's no blurry picture. It's a very clear picture. But so it's not a case of changing the visual input by low-level attentional processes. At least that is not the only process. There may be differences in eye tracking, of course. But it is not a modification that involves early visual processes in the sense, typically in the sense that the color and shape processes are in an early kind modified. What is happening is a restructuring, a reorganization of this input according to Gestalt psychological principles. Or we can also, if you like, what I prefer also, to use the predictive coding framework. Then there is a bottom-up processing, which in this case of restructuring has a kind of processing forward to restructuring and reorganization levels, starting feedback loops, such that maybe also top-down effects from these within the perceptual processing areas are taking place to produce a new kind of perceptual experience as we see it here. Okay, so late perceptual processing can in principle be distinguished from early perceptual processing such that this restructuring, reorganization processes are implemented. So, nevertheless, without going into details to characterize that very definitionally, I think the main idea is clear, but the challenge that is on the table for theories of cognitive penetration is the challenge from perceptual learning. And the challenge from perceptual learning can be characterized such that what in the case of a banana, or in the case of color concepts, or in the case of a concept cow is implemented, is a long-term learned and a long-term modification of the perceptual processing system. It's perceptual learning alone within the perceptual module that produces this effect or these effects that we have discussed. Can we make progress by dealing with this kind of challenge? First of all, the remark is in place here that opponents of cognitive penetration would at least grant some influence of higher cognition on perceptual processing, even if they are only long-term influences, because learning the concept cow also involves descriptive components and a combination of descriptive and perceptual components, and these concepts are given their interpretation. If it's all perceptual learning, then this must influence, this descriptive components must have a long-term influence in modifying our perceptual processing. Even if it's not instantaneous or short-term, it's a long-term modification, which may also be an interesting candidate for cognitive penetration, but that's something which is not as interesting as an instantaneous or short-term influence. Okay, therefore the question is, can we have any evidence for short-term influence of higher cognition on perceptual processing modifying the experience? And here a candidate I put on the table and comment on David Peters' criticism a bit later. Hypnotic suggestion in combination with a basic perceptual experience. What we definitely need is a basic perceptual experience, which is a kind of a clear case of a perceptual experience and not a perceptual judgment. And then hypnotic suggestions have the interesting aspect that they can be used to influence with a semantic content in a short-term period. Okay, so hypnosis, as we learned already, is a modified psychological state which allows us to use suggestions as short-term interventions on our informational processing. And now the prediction that we used in the experiment that I want to present now is the first the claim that if you start with a perceptual experience in normal consciousness and then implement the same perceptual experience under hypnosis, there should be, first of all, no difference in the perceptual experience. Only if you implement the suggestion under hypnosis, then the perceptual experience should be modified, because the suggestion with the semantic content should do the work. That's the logic behind this idea. And the experimental setting that we used is a so-called two-point discrimination task. The two-point discrimination task is illustrated here. So you put your finger on a position here, and underneath there are exactly two needles coming up. They are touching clearly, but slightly not hurting you, your finger, and you just have to report whether you feel two needles or just one. Because the distance is very fine-grained controlled. It can be made so small that it's going beyond your sensitivity. And then you are feeling only one or two touches. So what the experiment is done, you sit there, first in normal consciousness, you doing 60 trials, unsystematically varied, yeah, and you say, oh, 2, 1, now 2, again 2, and so on. Okay, and this is done under normal consciousness, under hypnosis with suggestion. And Now, and then we have two suggestions which I introduce in a minute, or now immediately. So here are the collaborators for these studies. It's medical professor Tegenthoff and psychiatrist Martin Prüne, and the students Marius Markmann and Agnes Stepane-Butte. So we kind of realized this experiment with the following conditions. You can just read this framework. So this is the first study that I can report on. We will complete a second replication, the data before Christmas, but I don't have them today. So basically this is from 16 participants, and the suggestion was following, suggestion 1. And now imagine you get a clinical drug. It has no side effects and does only one thing. It lets your finger grow or shrink, so of course one only. Let your finger shrink 5 times smaller, just not once you feel that the finger grew smaller. And then you wait until the participant nod, and then you start again this kind of measure of the 2-point discrimination task. And the results are that, so suggestion 1 is, imagine your finger grow 5 times bigger, larger. Imagine your finger grows 5 times smaller is suggestion 2. In the first study, we have a significant effect. So first of all, let me start with this observation. So this is the baseline, is the normal consciousness. The average is 1.5 millimeter, and so this average is the same in the case of hypnotic suggestion with hypnosis without any suggestion. Suggestion 0 means hypnosis without suggestion. So the first expectation is satisfied. We can use hypnosis without modifying the sensory experience. And now the suggestions are implemented. Suggestion 1 is that the finger is grown 5 times larger. Suggestion 2, the finger has grown 5 times smaller. And the effect is significant for the observation that the finger grow 5 times smaller. And you see a change in this direction. That means the sensitivity is decreased. In the case of imagine the finger is 5 times bigger, you see a small effect in the other direction, which is not significant yet. We have a first analysis of the data we have shows that this effect is now significant for a larger group, but we don't have the final data yet. So it seems to be that in both directions we can find significant effects, but this is actually clearly evaluated data which I report on here. So now, what does this mean and how can we interpret that? First of all, let me make a remark. So what, as I said at the beginning, we have the 3 conditions. We have the normal consciousness, hypnosis without suggestion, hypnosis with suggestion. So the only interpretation is that the effect and the change of the perceptual experience is based on the suggestion and its content, especially since the content has opposing effects. And this is a kind of the interpretation. Now, what about the critical remarks of David Bitter about hypnosis? Can we really say that this is already at the level of perceptual experience, or is it at the level of perceptual judgment? Yeah. And David Bitter makes the argument, the only thing that cognitive penetration does is it modifies our affective dimension and the affective dimension to feel something, to accept the judgment as being true. So it's a feeling that affects the judgmental level. Now let me make the following kind of characterization of the situation we are in. It's not completely settled, but we need to empirically demonstrate cognitive penetration, or to do that, we need to rule out the perceptual learning interpretation. And option 1, we need to have a short-term intervention, and hypnosis seems to be a good candidate, and maybe we find another candidate, but for the time being, it seems to be the best candidate, and there are not easy alternatives. If hypnosis is never changing sensory processing, as David Bitter argues, then we seem to lack a psychological method of relevant short-term intervention or activation, at least for the time being. But given the state of science, I still think we have evidence that effective processing takes place and effective modification takes place, but it's not ruled out that in addition sensory processing can be modified as well. We can still aim to show that for a concrete experiment, our experiment, we have to show that the modification is a modification of the sensory processing. And this is not yet done, but we have used and will interpret and see SEP data and EEG signals. Ideally, one would have fMRI, which we don't have this time. But we have some neuroscientific indicators and can then, in the full interpretation, see whether these indicators point in the direction of modification of somatosensory changes or not. The option 2 is, if we can't use hypnosis, if it doesn't work as a short-term intervention, we may have to have a closer look at the argument of perceptual learning. What exactly is the argument of perceptual learning excluding? I was granting a lot at the moment. We're saying it's excluding maybe all long-term modifications of the cognitive system, but the strategy for the debate about cognitive penetration that's left open is to discuss in detail what exactly the perceptual learning phenomena imply. But I'm not taking that route, it's just opening it as a way to go. So where are we with the debate? I try to show that we are actually searching for evidence for the intervention in early visual processing and late visual processing, indicating some standard experiments which are still on the table to be discussed as showing early visual processing, and for reasons of time also focused on one experiment on hypnosis that may be a good candidate for showing late visual processing only in combination with EEG data that show that perceptual processing, somatosensory changes are actually taking place. Okay, we'll have to wait for that result. Now, the intermediate summary is that cognitive penetration is at least the most plausible account, at least a plausible account, not ruled out, and the perceptual experience as well as early perceptual processes can be shaped according to that view by concepts or higher level cognitive processes. Okay, now let me go to a new perspective. Here a related debate, the debate between what is the relation between perception and cognition. Firestone and Scholl actually make a very close relation between cognitive penetration and the cognition-perception divide, and Nico Orlando also was kind of inclined to say if we allow for cognitive penetration, we are losing the cognition-perception divide. And I first want to discuss that shortly, give you evidence that we have to change our perspective here, but I also want to indicate that we have to change our perspective, that there is no radical perception-cognition divide, but nevertheless, we don't lose completely our perception-cognition distinction and can allow for cognitive penetration as well. So how is that going? So in the debate, to indicate already at the beginning, we have this kind of picture where we have the claim of the joint. There is only perception and cognition. They are clearly divided. And come at the end back to the picture of cognitive penetration of Andy Clark, where you have this hierarchy of processing starting from the input up to the priors, to the highest priors you need to resolve this input. And all of that is processing, and there is no reason to distinguish perception and cognition at all anymore. So we are confronted with a kind of either a radical divide or losing the distinction completely. And this seems to be the only option, the only game in town. And I think that's completely missing a third option. The third option to discuss is a second later, but yeah, maybe I'll show it first and then come back to the slide. The third option is that we have clear cases of cognition, propositional content. We have clear cases of perception, maybe adaptive perception. I say a bit more about that. And we have perception and cognition intertwined as a package that is characterizable as in between and deserves to be characterizable as in between. First, some of you have already noticed Ned Block's new book, Ned Block's new book. We discussed it in Venice recently, and the manuscript is kind of under discussion. And I think it's very interesting because he makes an argument that perception can be distinguished from cognition because perception has these 5 criteria. Adaptation happens, pop-out effects can be noticed, iconicity, analog tracking and mirroring, and rivalry. Without going into all this phenomena in detail, but I think most of you here know them. The package of these features is such that even if not all phenomena, that would be my interpretation now. I think Ned is a kind of inclined to interpret them as necessary and together sufficient conditions. I think that more of them as characteristic features, while to be a case of perception, a minimal package of these characteristic features have to be realized. Nevertheless, these features are really good candidates to characterize paradigmatic cases of perception. And therefore, perception as a paradigmatic case, we have heard about adaptation effects from Julia Smochkova, and these adaptation effects are very stable, very reliable, with low-level perceptual phenomena. Okay, but does this allow us to argue for a dichotomy, as Ned Block is doing, Firestone and Scholl are implying from their work? I think not. Why not? I give you first an example where I think that we can take one of the core examples of perception, and this core example of perception is a kind of so which that it cannot be characterized as a paradigmatic case of perception only, but that cognition is intermingled with perception here. And the case is the adaptation case of emotion, face-based recognition of emotions. So in this study, also used by Julia Smochkova, this is an angry face, this is a typical Ackman face of fear, and this is an absolute intermediate morph. And the adaptation case is such that if you are looking for a certain time at the angry face and then look at the intermediate face, you see it shifted, perceive it in the direction of a fearful face. So the adaptation in the opponent direction is happening at the other way around. So that seems to be a good candidate for a perceptual process because adaptation happens. Now one can, in addition, a remark to Julia Smochkova would be, maybe we have to do additional work here and separate out perceptual adaptation from cognitive adaptation. And this, she already indicated that this can be done. And now give me that this could be characterized as a case of perceptual cognition, perceptual adaptation. Then the interesting case which I make here into a schematic argument is the following. Emotion recognition is a perceptual process, it adapts, and it is realized as pattern recognition. Furthermore, pattern recognition of emotions can involve conceptual representations. There are several, this is not independent from the theory of emotion, but Lindquist, Feldman-Barrett and others argue that concepts are necessarily involved in basic emotion recognition. I myself and colleagues argue that it can be involved in emotion recognition. So the minimal common sense for at least a big part of emotion theories is such that pattern recognition of emotions can involve conceptual representations. And then, of course, the conclusion is that emotion recognition is a perceptual process and can involve conceptual information. And this is then, of course, this is a challenge, unless the opponent, like Ned Block, makes an argument, okay, what's going in there is some categorization, and categorization can go in, and this categorization is unproblematic, while it is not a case of conceptual classification, which would be really cognitive and problematic. But you see where the work is to be done. The work of the defender of cognitive impenetrability has to be that this can be really a case of unproblematic categorization in contrast to conceptual classification. And the evidence that I show now, the empirical evidence, points in the direction that these are distinctions that we philosophers like, but maybe they are not doing justice to the empirical processing and to the way we process categories and concepts. And that's what I'm aiming now. I'm aiming for giving you some empirical evidence to show that this kind of intermediate case, you may think of, okay, let's think of that and separate it into minimal cognition and high-level perception. And therefore, we can again have a divide between cognition and perception somewhere here. Isn't that possible? Now I think it's not that easy possible. And here I benefit a lot from the collaboration with Petra Vetter. We discussed that intensely, and also I simplify the discussion to this study, which I think is really telling in this case. Praki and Op de Beek from University of Leuven have done the following study. So let me run through that. So they have here 6 categories, which are a kind of minerals, animals, fruits. So they consciously didn't take basic concepts a la Roche, like table, chair, and dog. So they really have more abstract categories. And then they have categories which also are coming with some activity, music, sport, and tools. And then the other dimension is now the shape. So we have here the shape and we have the category. And this is a kind of, normally it's thought that the category is cognition and the shape is of course perceptual. And here the examples are really nicely taken, because here in this direction every example has a similar shape, and here these examples share the category, of course. And now what they did is a systematic fMRI study, taking the test person, and each test person saw all the pictures, the 45, is it 45? Or they have some intermingled pictures in between. I think it's 45 pictures at the end that they saw. So they saw all the pictures, and several times, and then they were measured the fMRI scan, and after that they made a kind of a multivoxel pattern analysis for each picture. Yeah? For each picture there's a multivoxel pattern analysis for each individual, and then you made a comparison of the similarity and the kind of processing comparison which lead to some results which I'll show you in a minute. Let me remind you about this dual processing stream that everyone knows. The dual processing is not undermined, but what I tell you now is actually, interestingly enough, shape and category features are processed in both streams, but there is some priority of a kind of these spatial dimensions here, and there's some priority of animacy and other dimensions here. Okay, so but so not that there's no misunderstanding, there is still some dominance of the standard job of dorsal stream and ventral stream. For processing dimensions, also in place here to mention that feedback connections largely outnumber feed-forward connections. So this is a kind of indicating that this kind of analysis of fMRI data is also that there is processing that allows for penetration. But that's what I'm now highlighting is the processing areas and the processing of the two dimensions. So the processing of shape is characterized in green. The processing of category similarity, it's always a similarity. Yeah? The similarity is characterized in green. The category similarity is in orange. And here are the areas. The areas actually from the early visual cortex up to the frontal areas, systematically characterized from left to right. BA17 is V1, BA18 is V2. So this is a kind of going up to dorsal prefrontal cortex. And the result is that you see the shape is processed almost all over. Significantly, the shape similarity is processed, maybe not processed only in the very frontal areas. The category is processed all over, only not in the very early V1. And so this seems to indicate, and the important thing is that we now have good reasons to cut that into three packages. Something where the shape processing is very dominant, and the end where the category processing is very dominant, and the dimension in the middle where both are taking place very significantly. Okay, and here is another picture to show that. So here is another, the correlations of shape according to the processing areas from the visual pathway to the frontal areas. And you here in the simplified similarity correlation, you see that shape is processed in the green earlier processing areas, that category in the late areas, and shape and category is processed in the intermediate areas. So I think this is a nice evidence that we should maybe give up the idea that cognition and perception are really two and the only two games in town that are distinguished by a joint. Maybe we better account for this kind of predictive coding hierarchy, which according to the processing dimensions that we just saw, process all these kind of different dimensions from motion to objects to simple scenes to complex scenes to something like beliefs. And this hierarchy of processing can then be distinguished such that these early parts are paradigmatic cases. This early processing, it's a resolution of what we experience is taking place at this early case without higher level, without having a resolution at this higher area. It's a case of perception. If the resolution is going up, it's a case of beliefs, and in between we have a kind of a rich object perception of everyday objects like laptops or motorbikes. So this alternative view perceives perception and cognition not as dichotomous, but this distinction is a heuristical theoretical simplification of a complex hierarchical process in which the brain operates. Perception and cognition can be paradigmatically distinguished as the endpoints of this hierarchy, but it's a very useful distinction, and this usefulness, this usefulness is a kind of shown in a lot of explanations that we rely on when we characterize cognitive phenomena and the mental life as perceptual or cognitive. So this is the main upshot here. So cognitive penetration, I think, is still the most plausible account. The perceptual experience as well as early perceptual processes can be shaped by concepts or high-level processes, despite, I grant, that this is not settled, and we have to, I indicated where the ways are we have to go to either show that this is the most plausible account still, or we may disprove it. But we need a new way to characterize the relation between perception and cognition. And this way of looking at perception and cognition, according to what I presented, is maybe shaping, introducing a little bit of skepticism, whether we really can start off with this picture that there is cognition and perception, and there is a divide, and then the question is whether cognition can influence perception. If we change this starting point, then it is much more plausible that cognition, in some sense, which has to be spelled out, is a kind of influencing our perceptual experience, because in the intermingled case, there are cognitive categorical dimension already in place. There is a parallel and similar processing, parallel processing of this kind of dimensions, which are shown in the data. So let me end with indicating that Bochum is next year making a big event. The European Conference of Cognitive Science is taking place in Bochum at the beginning of September 2019. You're all invited. The call is still open for papers and posters until March, for symposia until end of January. Thank you very much for your attention.